The sound of the bulldozer engine roared through the quiet Connecticut neighborhood that summer morning in 1978. Residents looked out their windows in confusion. Construction on a weekday morning wasn't unusual, but this was different. The bulldozer wasn't being operated by a professional crew. It was being driven by a 71-year-old woman in pants and a work shirt, her famous face set in an expression of absolute determination. Katharine Hepburn had decided to settle a property dispute the old-fashioned way by driving a bulldozer straight through the contested land herself. This is the story of the day Hollywood's greatest actress became a construction worker, and why sometimes the only way to prove a point is to literally reshape the earth beneath your feet. The dispute had been brewing for months. Hepburn's property in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, had been in her family for decades. The estate sprawled across several acres, including beachfront access to Long Island Sound. It was her sanctuary, the place she escaped to when Hollywood became too much. The problem started when new neighbors moved in next door. They were wealthy, connected, and had opinions about property lines. Specifically, they believed that a section of land Hepburn had been using as part of her garden actually belonged to them. Not the house, not the beach access. Just a strip of land, maybe 40 feet wide, that ran along the property boundary. Most people would have hired lawyers. Katharine Hepburn decided to handle it differently. The neighbors had started the conflict politely enough. A letter arrived, professionally written, suggesting there might be a discrepancy in the property boundaries. Would Miss Hepburn be willing to have the land surveyed? Hepburn ignored it. She'd been using that land for 40 years. Her father had used it before her. As far as she was concerned, possession was 9/10 of the law, and she possessed it. A second letter arrived, less polite. The neighbors had hired a surveyor. According to their expert, the disputed strip definitely belonged to them. They would appreciate if Hepburn would stop maintaining the garden that extended onto their property. Hepburn responded with a single-sentence note, "I disagree with your survey. The land is mine." That's when things escalated. The neighbors erected a small fence along what they claimed was the property line. Not a permanent structure, just stakes and rope, but the message was clear. Hepburn removed it the same day, just walked out with wire cutters and took the whole thing down. The neighbors put it back up. Hepburn took it down again. This went on for 2 weeks, a ridiculous battle of wills over 40 feet of Connecticut soil. The neighbors threatened legal action. Hepburn told them to do whatever they felt they needed to do. She wasn't intimidated by lawyers. She dealt with studio executives, directors, and some of the most powerful men in Hollywood. A property dispute in Connecticut was not going to make her back down. But the neighbors were persistent. They filed for an injunction to prevent Hepburn from using the disputed land while the legal process played out. The local court, perhaps intimidated by the famous name involved, granted a temporary order. Until the dispute was settled, Hepburn was legally prohibited from maintaining or altering the contested strip. This was a mistake. Telling Katharine Hepburn she couldn't do something was the surest way to make her do it. She consulted with her own lawyers. They explained the situation. Yes, technically the injunction meant she should stay off the disputed land, but there were gray areas. If she genuinely believed the land was hers, if she could demonstrate a history of use, the court might be sympathetic. Hepburn heard gray areas and made a decision. She was going to settle this dispute permanently. She was going to landscape the entire contested area, make it so obviously part of her property that no judge could possibly award it to the neighbors. And she was going to do it herself. This is where the bulldozer enters the story. Hepburn didn't own a bulldozer. She rented one from a local equipment company, paying cash, refusing to explain what she needed it for. The rental company assumed she was hiring an operator. They were surprised when she said she'd be driving it herself. "Ma'am, do you know how to operate heavy machinery?" "I'll figure it out." And she did. Katharine Hepburn, at 71 years old, taught herself to drive a bulldozer by reading the manual and practicing in an empty field for 2 hours. By the 3rd hour, she was proficient enough to do what she needed to do. The neighbors woke up that morning to the sound of earth-moving equipment tearing through what they considered their property. By the time they got outside to see what was happening, Hepburn had already cleared a significant section. She'd leveled the ground, removed rocks, created a smooth surface that was obviously prepared for landscaping. They called the police. The police arrived, saw Katharine Hepburn on a bulldozer, and weren't entirely sure what to do. Was this a crime? She was on disputed property, yes, but she claimed it was hers. The injunction said she couldn't maintain the land, but was bulldozing it maintenance or improvement. And honestly, did they really want to arrest Katharine Hepburn? The officers approached cautiously. Hepburn shut off the bulldozer and climbed down. She was covered in dust, sweating in the summer heat, and completely unbothered by the chaos she'd created. "Miss Hepburn, we've received a complaint about destruction of property." "It's my property. I'm improving it." There's an injunction. The injunction is based on a faulty survey. This land has been in my family for 40 years. I'm simply making that fact obvious to anyone with eyes. The police didn't arrest her. They couldn't quite figure out the legal grounds, and more importantly, they didn't want to. This was a civil dispute, they decided. Let the courts handle it. They advised both parties to avoid further confrontation and left. The neighbors immediately called their lawyers. Their lawyers called Hepburn's lawyers. Everyone agreed this had gotten out of hand. Hepburn, meanwhile, spent the rest of the day finishing her bulldozing work. By evening, the entire disputed strip had been cleared, leveled, and prepared for planting. The neighbors filed an emergency motion claiming destruction of property. Hepburn's lawyers filed a counter-motion claiming she was making improvements to her own land. The judge, exasperated with both parties, ordered an immediate hearing. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread that Katharine Hepburn was in a property dispute and had driven a bulldozer to prove her point. Reporters showed up. Curious locals filled the gallery. Hepburn arrived in pants and a blazer, looking exactly like someone who'd spent yesterday operating heavy machinery. The neighbors arrived with their lawyer and multiple binders of documentation. The hearing was fascinating. The neighbors presented their survey, their expert testimony, their technical documentation. Hepburn's lawyers presented historical property records, photographs spanning 40 years showing the Hepburn family using the disputed land, and testimony from longtime residents. Then Hepburn herself testified. She didn't perform. She didn't try to charm the judge. She simply stated facts. Her father had purchased the property in the 1920s. The family had maintained the entire area, including the disputed strip, for decades. No previous owner had ever challenged their use. The current neighbors had lived there less than 2 years and were trying to redraw boundaries based on a survey that contradicted 40 years of actual use. "Your Honor," she said, "I drove a bulldozer through that land yesterday because it's mine. I've been swimming in these waters, walking on that earth, maintaining that garden since before these people were born. A piece of paper saying otherwise doesn't change reality." The judge asked about the injunction. Why had she violated it? Because it was wrong. Sometimes you have to disobey unjust orders to prove they're unjust. This was classic Hepburn. The same logic that had her wearing pants when studios forbade it. The same principle that had her rebuilding her career on her own terms after being declared box office poison. Rules that didn't make sense didn't deserve obedience. The judge was not amused by this philosophy. He lectured Hepburn about respecting court orders, about proper legal processes, about how disputes were supposed to be settled through documentation rather than bulldozers. Hepburn listened politely and showed no sign of regret. Then the judge made his ruling. After reviewing all evidence, including the historical documentation of use, he found in favor of Hepburn. The land was hers. The neighbor's survey had been incorrect, or at least was contradicted by 40 years of adverse possession. The disputed strip would remain part of the Hepburn property. However, because Hepburn had violated the injunction, even if the injunction itself was based on faulty premises, she was fined $500 for contempt of court. Hepburn paid the fine immediately, in cash, without complaint. As far as she was concerned, $500 was a bargain price for settling a property dispute permanently. The neighbors were furious. They'd lost the land dispute and been humiliated in the process. But there was nothing they could do. The ruling was final. The land was legally Hepburn's, and she'd proven her point in the most dramatic way possible. The story spread quickly through Connecticut and then to the national press. Headlines like "Katharine Hepburn drives bulldozer in property dispute" appeared in newspapers across the country. Some portrayed her as eccentric, some as admirable. Everyone agreed it was the most Katharine Hepburn thing she could have possibly done. Friends who heard the story had mixed reactions. Some thought it was hilarious. Katharine Hepburn on a bulldozer was such a perfect image of her character. Practical, stubborn, willing to do whatever it took. Others worried she'd gone too far, that violating a court order set a bad precedent. Hepburn didn't care about any of it. She'd defended her property. She'd won. That was all that mattered. She spent the next week planting gardens on the newly cleared land. Roses, hydrangeas, native Connecticut plants. She did most of the work herself, on her knees in the dirt, making the disputed strip so obviously, beautifully part of her property that no one would ever question it again. The neighbors moved away within a year. Whether they left because of the property dispute or for unrelated reasons was never clear, but people in Old Saybrook liked to think the bulldozer incident had something to do with it. You don't win disputes with Katharine Hepburn, you just lose them more or less gracefully. The bulldozer story became part of Hepburn lore. People who lived in Old Saybrook would point out her property to visitors and tell the tale. "See that garden there? Katharine Hepburn drove a bulldozer through it in the 70s. It became a point of local pride, a story that captured something essential about the woman who lived among them. What's interesting about this incident is what it reveals about Hepburn's approach to conflict. She didn't delegate. She didn't hide behind lawyers. When there was a problem, she addressed it directly, personally, even if that meant teaching herself to operate heavy machinery at 71. This was the same approach she'd taken throughout her career. When studios tried to control her, she fought them directly. When her career stalled, she personally produced the Philadelphia story. When someone invaded her privacy, she confronted them herself. The Bulldozer incident also highlighted her complete lack of concern for appearances. Most celebrities, especially women of her generation, would have been mortified at the image of themselves on construction equipment, covered in dust, doing manual labor. Hepburn didn't care. The job needed doing. She did it. This attitude extended to how she lived her entire life. She swam in freezing water because it was healthy. She wore pants because they were practical. She lived how she wanted, doing what she wanted, and public opinion was irrelevant. The $500 fine for contempt became a badge of honor in her mind. She'd been willing to pay a price to defend her principles. The price turned out to be minor, but she would have paid more if necessary. Some things were worth fighting for, and property that had been in her family for decades was one of them. Years later, when asked about the incident in an interview, Hepburn was characteristically blunt. "Someone tried to take my land. I stopped them. I used a bulldozer because it was efficient. I'd do it again." No apologies, no acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, there were better ways to handle property disputes. Just straightforward certainty that she'd done the right thing and would do it again if circumstances required. The interviewer pressed, wasn't she concerned about setting a bad example? Hepburn's response was perfect. The law was wrong. Sometimes civil disobedience is the only way to correct injustice. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't destroy anything of value. I just moved some earth on my own property. Of course, no one was going to arrest a 71-year-old woman who'd won 4 Oscars for improving her own land. The fine had been paid. The land was legally hers. The matter was settled. The bulldozer itself was returned to the rental company with more wear than expected. The company reportedly framed the rental agreement and hung it on their office wall. The day Katharine Hepburn rented our bulldozer became one of their favorite stories. The disputed land remained part of Hepburn's property for the rest of her life. The gardens she planted that week grew and flourished. Long after the neighbors who'd challenged her were gone, long after the court case was forgotten by everyone except local historians, those gardens remained, a living testament to Katharine Hepburn's absolute refusal to back down from a fight she believed was just. When Hepburn died in 2003, obituaries mentioned many things: her 4 Oscars, her legendary relationship with Spencer Tracy, her fierce independence. Some also mentioned the bulldozer incident, always with affectionate amusement. Only Katharine Hepburn would settle a property dispute with heavy machinery. But underneath the amusement was something deeper. The bulldozer story wasn't just about an eccentric celebrity. It was about a woman who understood that sometimes you have to be willing to look ridiculous, to violate conventions, to do things yourself if you want them done right. Katharine Hepburn drove a bulldozer at 71 because no one else was going to defend her property the way it needed defending. She violated a court order because she knew the order was wrong and was willing to pay the price to prove it. She turned a legal dispute into a spectacle because sometimes spectacle is the only way to make people pay attention. And she won, not just the legal case, but the larger point. You don't mess with Katharine Hepburn's property. You don't mess with her principles. You don't challenge her unless you're prepared to see her show up on a bulldozer ready to literally move earth to prove her point. That garden in Old Saybrook, the one she bulldozed and planted in 1978, still exists in some form. The property changed hands after her death, but the basic landscape she created remains. And locals still tell the story of the day Katharine Hepburn got on a bulldozer and won a war.